Now, what a lovely, lovely welcome for one of our most eminent citizens who we are utterly privileged to have with us here today. This is the opening event of the First Thought strand of the Galway International Arts Festival. And at First Thought, we aim for enlightenment rather than confusion, informed and eloquent speakers from all sections of society, and for light rather than heat. So what you won't be hearing, I hope, over the next 2 days and the following weekend will be people shouting over each other and vying for attention instead of trying to inform us about things we need to learn about. So climate change is probably the most pressing existential crisis of our times. Our theme this year is borders for the entire festival, and we've chosen to interpret that term as broadly as possible to encompass obstacles, barriers, and threats of various kinds, including mental illness, lack of access to housing, our treatment of asylum seekers, fertility issues, reproduction issues, our understanding of what being transgender means, creative obstacles, sexual harassment, and sport as both a unifying and a divisive force, as well as the obvious topics of the Irish border, Brexit, Mr. Trump's dangerous redefinition of immigration, iconic walls all over the world, and the experiences and journeys undergone by those affected by the Syrian conflict and those trying to cross the Mediterranean to safety. And we have a session on Shakespeare and a divided America, because there's always something new to be learned from Shakespeare. Climate change is the most prominent threat to the future of our species and many others on this planet. The success of Green parties, including our own, in the recent European elections points to the fact that at last the message is getting through. Next weekend, we'll have a session with Eamon Ryan, leader of our Green Party, and some of the wonderful Galway school children who followed Greta Thunberg's example and protested against inactivity on climate change. Now, we have a full program that's available free, obviously, to everyone. Have a look at it. Look particularly at what's happening next weekend, because we're going to have the crew of the Ellie Samuel Beckett, who are our wonderful naval men and women who have been going out into the Mediterranean for a number of years until they were stopped by the closure of the Italian ports to rescue people coming on really dangerous rafts from Libya, and that is an extraordinary story. They very rarely talk in public. I commend it to you. We will also have a number of people living in direct provision to tell us exactly what that experience is like and what their potential solutions might be. And we will have, interestingly, because housing is such a huge issue in Ireland at the moment, John Moran, who's the new head of the Land Development Agency, probably the most powerful land agency in this country since the Land Commission was set up over 100 years ago. And he's somebody worth listening to. He's also somebody who needs to be interrogated about his ideas. What are his plans for the gigantic land bank that he will have at his disposal? So again, lots of things for next weekend. But back to this morning. We are, as I said, privileged and delighted to have Mary Robinson as our keynote speaker for First Thought on this most important of issues. All of you will know that she was our first female president, that she is a former UN Commissioner for Human Rights, that she is a member of the Elders, and that she has made climate change her particular focus in recent years. Her book Climate Justice lays out her thoughts on the subject with a feminist emphasis, as we might expect, and a cautiously optimistic conclusion. And for that, we should be grateful, because the whole story of climate change can appear to be overwhelmingly dreadful. It would be easy to take refuge in despair and say there's nothing we can do and just give up. This book gives us hope that there are things that can be done, albeit difficult things, but they must be done. So we're thrilled to have Mary, and very grateful that she agreed to come here today. To interview Mary, we're lucky to have Professor John Sweeney, who's one of Ireland's foremost experts on climate change and a contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that very august body whom Mr. Trump dismisses as fake news, as is his wont, the most eminent international body which it is to pronounce on the subject. Over the past 30 years, he has published approximately 60 scientific papers and edited or co-authored 4 texts on various aspects of climatology and climate change in Ireland. He has served a number of national academic societies as president, secretary, and treasurer, as well as being the Irish representative on a number of European academic bodies. He currently leads a number of nationally funded research projects examining various aspects of climate change in Ireland. He is a regular contributor to our print media. And he is going to start our event this morning with a short-ish PowerPoint and then move on to chatting to Mary, and we will have, I hope, 20 minutes at the end for you to ask questions. So please welcome Professor John Sweeney.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and welcome to the event today. I'm so delighted you all turned up to hear me. I'm flattered. But reality, of course, is that I'm really so delighted to be essentially a warm-up person for you, for the real star of our show this morning, who you'll hear later on. But I wanted to say a few words about climate to develop a few themes with you, which we may turn our attention to later in the morning as well. And this, of course, being an arts festival, I thought I should start with some art. And this, of course, is a very famous painting that you all know. It's Constable's Haywain, painted way back in the idyllic days before the Industrial Revolution in 1821, essentially. And the beauty of technology today is, of course, that we can set our digital cameras down today exactly where Constable set his easel down all of those decades and decades ago. And when we look at the scene today from the same perspective as John Constable, well, we see a very different kind of scene. Some things the environment retains. You can see the built environment still there. You can see some elements of the hydrosphere. The vegetation has changed. Some of the elements of what's growing and not growing have changed. And of course, it tells us that our environment is very dynamic. And the driving forces for much of that change, some of them biological, some of them human-related, but a lot of them driven by the forces of climate itself. And we're today looking at that driving force and what we can do about it, because as you know, looking at the way the world has changed in the past century, the world has warmed up substantially. We're seeing also very distinct geographical changes between the land masses and the oceans. And we're seeing, therefore, a situation where when we talk about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees as the global average, conditions will be very different on land and on the cities, in the cities in which we live. So we have to bear that in mind as you see the world warming substantially. And warming to the extent, of course, that we now have the 4 warmest years in the instrumental record during the past 4 years. And for those of you under the age of 30, and there are many in the audience this afternoon, well, you've never experienced during your life a month in which the average temperature of that month was less than the average temperature of the whole of the 20th century months concerned. So you can see that we're living in exceptional times. And in terms of what's driving those changes, it's quite clear we're looking at changes that we've made to the atmosphere itself. This transect from the South Pole to the North Pole shows the way in which our concentrations of carbon dioxide have risen substantially. You can see how it's rather more volatile in the northern hemisphere, the right-hand side of the map, of the graph there, because on the northern hemisphere there's a lot more land, and plants take in carbon dioxide when the leaves are on the trees, and then when the leaves fall off the trees and our vegetation dies during the winter, then the carbon dioxide levels increase. And that's very different to the southern hemisphere, where you can see it's much more stable. You can see that it's mostly, obviously, therefore composed of ocean. So we're looking at distinct geographical differences in the way in which the atmosphere responds to what we're changing in the atmosphere in terms of its composition. But you'll see also that dramatic rise that's been going on over the past few decades. You'll see the way in which it starts life here in 1979 at about 336 parts per million. And gradually, as the years have gone on since then, how we've increased the concentrations so that today, well, we're not far short of about 410 parts per million. And that's quite a substantial transformation we've achieved in a very short period of time. You may wonder, of course, whether it's something that's very recent or something that's been long-standing. And our records don't go back very well beyond the 1970s, so we have to rely on a much shorter and much, if you like, reduced network of stations. Essentially one key station in the Hawaiian Islands on Mauna Loa, and it'll appear shortly in terms of a little green line on the right-hand side there, pushing that record back. That sawtooth you see there on the right is the Earth essentially breathing breathing in and breathing out carbon dioxide. And you can see that when we pushed our record back a little, well, the news is that there hasn't been much in the way of a trend change. You can see that it's something that's been going on for some time. And if we want to push that record back even further and use very sophisticated methods of analyzing little bubbles in the ice caps, we can see that it never really goes up to that level of the concentrations that we have today. Indeed, it settles down, you can see, at about 280 parts per million, what we call the pre-industrial level of carbon dioxide. So we're well on the way to doubling our pre-industrial level of greenhouse gases, and that's what's implicated in the very rapid changes we've seen in temperature over the past few decades. Even when we push that record back, way back 850,000 years, and it picks out the ice cap, the ice ages, and the interglacials very well, when things were growing in the interglacials, but not growing in the ice ages, you can see it never threatens that pre-industrial level seriously, all the way back for about 800,000 years. So we're living in really exceptional times when we've changed the atmosphere very considerably indeed. We can't see it, of course. This is what a ton of carbon dioxide would look like. And for every one of us here today, that's, let me go back if I, no, that's what we would be producing every day in Ireland, 160,000 of those bubbles, not for every one of us, for the nation as a whole. If we piled them up outside Dublin Bay here, that's what the mountain would look like. So we're in exceptional times when we're producing a lot more per capita in Ireland than even the average European person does. Everyone has their kind of conversion on the road to Damascus, and I suppose one very important event for me was a visit to Africa about 5 years ago in a small village hall here, away in the backwoods of Zambia, when, rather like a church in the west of Ireland, all the men sat on one side and all the women sat on the other side. But the old man here, of course, was somebody that I wanted to talk to because he had the longest memory. And what he told me was, yeah, I'm finding it very hard. The rains have become so unreliable. I used to go out and know when to plant my seeds and harvest my crop, but now I go out and the crop shrivels up because the rains don't come, or even when I go out to harvest my crop, the rains have withdrawn 3 weeks early and my crops have shriveled up in the field. And the question on his lips here was, well, who's doing this? Who's responsible? And I hadn't the heart to say, really, it's us. It's us in the developed world that's causing this problem. I went a little further on that trip to the famous Victoria Falls. This is what they looked like in June 2015, where the great falls power into the largest man-made lake on Earth and supply hydropower through the Kariba Dam. 91% of the electricity of Zambia comes from this. I didn't go in June 2015. I went in September, and this is what it looked like. And of course, yes, it was the dry season, but it was also the biggest drought in 50 years. So there was no water going into the dam. There was no hydropower being generated for the towns and cities of that vast country. And when you think about this, you realize that, well, what do people do to cook their evening meal? You don't need, obviously, electricity for heat there, but you do have a problem cooking your evening meal in the cities. You need charcoal. And so the charcoal sellers would deforest the landscape around them to sell charcoal to the urban dwellers. And here's the important bit. All of that meant that the people at the bottom of society suffered most. In this case, the people going out collecting firewood, the women. And so there's a gender aspect to climate change, which Mary will no doubt talk about, an aspect of social inequality, which comes in as well. And of course, we see that in terms of the poorest people in the world suffering most, the great mega deltas of Bangladesh, for example, where people will lose a large part of their country, the small island states, where cultures will be effectively extinguished, and of course the marginal zones of Africa where we know very, very well the kind of suffering that will occur there. So these are some of the themes that we will touch on later on, and of course we know that the culprits are also very clearly identified as the developed world. Looking at the area here in proportion to greenhouse gas emissions, you can see how little the peoples of the third world contribute to the overall problem. Unless we think that this little island up here is insignificant in the story, Ireland emits more greenhouse gases than the 400 million poorest people on this planet. And that's quite a sobering statistic as we talk about climate justice later on. The other theme that I think is quite important here is just looking to the future. And I've been talking about the present, but looking to the future, we know from the IPCC reports that trend of growing temperature, increasing temperature, is likely to continue if we continue along a business as usual trajectory. We know that some of the rainfall changes will be the key, not even the temperature changes, especially in those parts of the world which don't get enough rainfall. And we know that there are now certain tipping points. And that's been one of the more recent discoveries. And it relates to something we will talk about later on, the Paris Agreement, because we know that in this zone of 1.5 to 2 degrees, if we exceed it, we will lose certain valuable ecosystems. We will lose the coral reefs. We will start perhaps the irrecoverable melting of Greenland. We will lose, by and large, the alpine glaciers. We will start to cause problems for the West Antarctic ice sheet. These are the key ecosystems that Paris is meant to protect. And without that, of course, you will be talking to your grandchildren and their grandchildren. What was it like, Granny, when you had coral reefs? What was it like when you had glaciers in the Alps or there was ice on Greenland? This is the legacy we have to think about. And of course, we have even more serious consequences should we not control our temperature rises within those limits, serious consequences which may disrupt the planet's circulation system even more comprehensively down the road. So it's crucial that we try and control our temperature rise by limiting our greenhouse gas emissions. And the IPCC have told us that we have a very limited time period to do that. Carbon stays in the atmosphere for centuries. So we're breathing today what was emitted in the First World War and earlier. So we have to consider a long-term perspective for our carbon budget. And without doing that today, then we face the consequences of an increase in temperature above that crucial 1.5 degrees sometime within the next 12 to 20 years. And that's where our tipping point problem begins then to become even more severe. So that's part of the issues that we have to think about, and we have therefore to take drastic action. We know that we have to start reducing our emissions very substantially to, at least in the developed world, to reach net carbon balance, net zero carbon emissions, sometime within the next 30 years at the very worst. And without that, then we face the consequences of reaching those tipping points. Of course, if we had started when Mary was talking 20 years ago and other people were identifying the problem 10, 20 years ago, we could have a more leisurely approach of a reduction maybe of about 3% a year. But now we've postponed action and we have to face almost a cliff in terms of reduction if we have to achieve those particular targets. It's not something for the developing world. It's not something for people in Africa. It's something that's affecting us here in Ireland. We've already warmed up here in Ireland by 0.5 degree throughout the island in the past 30 years. Whichever weather station you take, that evidence is quite clear. We know for the future we have another 0.5 degree in the system. We know also that our problem in Ireland will probably be rainfall, more of it in the west in winter, less of it in summer in the east. And that poses two problems that we have to spend a lot of money thinking about. First of all, flood problems for places that have too much water in winter, like Galway. That's going to get problematical in the future. And secondly, water supply issues for our towns and cities, especially in the east, and for our agricultural systems as well. It poses problems also for extremes, because we're seeing those extremes now develop in Ireland. We've had the wettest winter on record in 2013-14. We've had the stormiest... I've gone too far. We had the stormiest winter also on record, and we've begun also now to see problems with new emerging issues such as hurricanes beginning to approach our shores, which we didn't have before. and you'll remember Ophelia and the problems that that posed. And we're getting extremes becoming a feature of Irish climate. The beast from the east, Storm Emma, indicating that problems with our jet streams are beginning to emerge, problems where they're becoming more wobbly, and we're getting more extremes in the northern hemisphere. Last year we had snow in the Sahara Desert in January, not something you'd expect. We had the North Pole above freezing point in February and March. The jet streams becoming ever more problematical, wobbling a bit more than they used to, giving us extremes of both types. For Ireland, of course, it means we have issues of agriculture. What can we grow in the future? Well, our cereals will do quite well. Maize, in particular, will be a good crop. Potatoes, so enigmatic and so part of our psyche in Ireland, will not do well in a dry summer. And we know from last year that grass will not do particularly well either. But many of our landscapes also face threats. Dry summers are not going to be good for our boglands. They're not going to be good for our lovely landscapes around Connemara of Machair. Rising sea level is not going to be good for our salt marshes, and of course our montane habitats are going to be affected as the temperature threshold rises up to higher levels, and ecosystems and species which, like cold, are going to be threatened. We don't look after some of those great carbon stores anyway particularly well, as you can see. But species that we take for granted in our youth, like the curlew, the corncrake, species maybe that you're not too familiar with, like the Arctic char in our Corrie lakes high up, or even the Atlantic salmon, which we don't get too far south in Europe than Ireland, too much of them. These are the species which are going to be particularly at risk here in our own country. We don't value biodiversity in Ireland. We pay lip service to it. We budget about 11 million for our annual budget for national parks and wildlife, and just by comparison, we give a lot more to things like the Greyhound Racing Board, to Horse Racing Ireland, 6 times as much almost. These are worthy causes also, but it's an indication, perhaps, of where our priorities lie. And of course, we have another issue in that we have a geographical spread in Ireland where people that do look after our landscapes and are paid by the Common Agricultural Policy are predominantly here in the west of Ireland. The smaller family farms, where up to 90% of their income, you can see over here on the right, the green areas, are coming from schemes to help them look after biodiversity. And that's a very different picture in the east. But ironically, the people in the east, the intensive farmers, get twice as much in the way of income from the Common Agricultural Policy as those farms in the west. So we have issues in terms of equity there as well. We often hear about the cost of climate change. We don't hear about the cost of doing nothing. If we look at the GISs of our heights in our towns and cities and look at where our people live, we can do very accurate calculations now of how much particular sea level rises would cost our towns and cities. This is Dublin Bay, but you can see for Galway, for example, here, you can see how a 2 or 3 meter event, which is very small relatively, will cost about 60 million euros. For the country as a whole, you can see how a 3 meter event would cost in terms of insurance claims over 2 billion. These are costs that we should be adding to our policy measures as well. And we know that some of them are very large indeed. Ireland has not been performing well, as you all know. It's away down the league table here in 48th position. We hope that that will be reversed in the next few years with action now beginning to be taken. And one of the most encouraging things that we may chat about later is the way in which people, young people especially, have grasped the nettle on this important topic. A 94-year-old man, David Attenborough, a 16-year-old girl, Greta Thunberg, have between them mobilized the world's population. And this is one of the most encouraging things, I think, to emerge in the past few years that we may chat about as well. So I'm nearly finished. We're talking about politicians now beginning to grasp the nettle, developing plans. There are good things and bad things about some of those plans. The governance aspects may be very good, but really when you scratch under the surface, you find that the best will in the world will enable a 3% reduction in our emissions in Ireland to take place. So we need to do more, and we need to do more faster. One issue that we are going to touch on is climate justice, of course, and we have to ask the question, what should Ireland have as a fair proportion of the Earth's remaining carbon budget, given that we know we have only a certain amount to burn before we enter those tipping points? How much should countries claim? And very recent work has suggested that sometime in the next 5 years, Ireland will enter carbon debt under present circumstances. That countries will therefore be asking Ireland in the future, repay your debt on this particular topic. However, that's where I want to leave it, and that's where the PowerPoint's leaving me. So I will stop at that point, and I will, with pleasure, introduce you to the star of our show this morning. And really, it's a person who needs no introduction from me. You all know very well Mary Robinson. You know her as perhaps somebody who was a very well-known lawyer, a very well-known politician, and also a diplomat who served as one of the most eminent presidents of Ireland, the first woman president of Ireland in recent years, and also as United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights up till 2002. Mary has also, of course, a very distinguished academic career, a distinguished career as High Commissioner, as I said. She has been the recipient of numerous awards and honors. In 2004, Amnesty International awarded her its Ambassador of Conscience Award for human rights work, and she later received the US Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2009. I lost count of the number of honorary degrees she has, around 24 at the moment, but I think she needs really no introduction to talk to you this morning, so I'm very pleased to welcome Professor and President Mary Robinson to us this evening. I think they cut me off on purpose. Now, I hope this is working. You can hear me okay. That's good. Okay, well, I first of all wanted to welcome Mary because Mary is, in a sense, coming home this morning to us because she is somebody whose roots lie in the west of Ireland, just a little north of here in Ballina, County Mayo. So in welcoming you, Mary, I wanted to ask you, where is home these days for you? And what was it like growing up in the 1960s, I suppose, in North Mayo?
Well, I'm really glad to be back in the west of Ireland always. And I think, I'm defined by growing up in the west of Ireland, growing up in Ballina, looking out on the River Moy and dreaming the way, young people dream, and watching the salmon being caught in the nets just below. I could see that from my bedroom. And, my brother Henry, who drove us here, who lives here in Galway, and myself went to a small school in Ballina called Miss Ruddy's. The one teacher, well, she had a second teacher towards the end, but mainly it was Miss Ruddy herself. And I wrote a memoir some years ago, and I called it Everybody Matters, but I could have called it Long Way from Miss Ruddy's. How do you know when you're growing up in a town, what life will bring, or, so I feel very lucky in life, to be honest.
And you came from a family of medical doctors, of course, as well, both your parents.
And, my two elder brothers became doctors, but I led my two younger brothers into law, so we won out.
Well, you're no good at science.
I have recently received a very important scientific hat.
Great.
Now, the truth is, no, I don't know science, but I've been asked to be one of two patrons of the International Science Council. And as you probably know, John, that was formed last year from an amalgamation of two huge scientific bodies, the International Council for Science and the International Social Science Council.
Yes.
And the fact that they would merge was really very important because it came out in your PowerPoint earlier. We have to match the hard science and know that that is non-negotiable with the humanities, with the climate justice, with the gender, with all of that. The reason I was asked, and Ismail Serageldin, who was the librarian of the wonderful library in Alexandria in Egypt, which I visited a number of times, he and I are to kind of talk up the science, because some scientists, I exclude you from this, some scientists are very bad at explaining what science is about. And that's one of the problems. So they need people like us to pretend we're scientists and do the explaining, you know?
That's very true, and in fact, one of the problems of the last 10 years has been that sometimes scientists have this tunnel mentality that you can draw a little box, put an arrow in at one end and an arrow at the other end, and A causes B. But they forget to include people, and they forget to include the complications that arise when you put people into the equation. So we do need urgently to add on the social science aspect to the climate message. And I think you're right. I think scientists have failed to convey that message successfully. It's not part of their brief, of course, in a sense. It's part of their brief to publish papers and do research. But you're quite right. I think it's essential that we broaden that message considerably.
But unlike you, John, I'm a latecomer to understanding the importance of climate change. When I say a latecomer, I mean I served, after my term as president, I served for 5 years as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I don't remember making a single significant speech, because there was another part of the UN dealing with climate, and I was in my silo. You know, big organizations deal in silos, which is a problem. And it wasn't until I went, I formed a small organization called Realizing Rights to work in African countries on the rights that are most important if you don't have them. The rights to food and safe water, health, education, shelter. And I was honorary president of Oxfam at the time as well, and they would wheel me out, and I would travel a lot to different parts of Africa working on health, etc. And I kept hearing this sentence, more or less the same all over Africa: things are so much worse now, we don't understand. A lot of women would say to me, we thought God was punishing us, you know, because this was outside their experience. And I wrote about this a lot in the book on climate justice. This is a storybook. There are 11 stories, 9 of them involve women, and also there are 2 good men. And they're about, the shock to poor countries and poor communities who are not responsible, and how they became resilient and how they fought back. And my first climate conference was Copenhagen, where it was thought we would solve the problem. And I was shocked. I was genuinely shocked. The conversation, the entire discussion was technical. It was small, printy, in the weeds, very scientific at one level and technical. Nothing about people, nothing about human rights, nothing about gender. And that's why I formed my foundation on climate justice, to be able to argue, to put human rights and gender front and center. And we did that in the Paris Climate Agreement, which I must say, when I say we, the foundation worked with a whole range of other people, including a great constituency of women, to get gender into the Paris Agreement. But I want to just reflect on the position that I was in during the negotiations before Paris, because I had been appointed by Ban Ki-moon as his special envoy on climate change. And so I was a kind of privileged observer. And I observed, first of all, in September 2015, the negotiations and conclusion of the 2030 agenda with its sustainable development goals. And I'm afraid we don't know nearly enough about that. I mean, I can't see most of the audience, because I'd love to ask for hands up of how many people are familiar with the 2030 agenda. Yes, lights up. Okay, how many? Okay, I see a reasonable number of hands going up. But actually, we should all be living those sustainable development goals. That's what it's all about. Ireland reported recently in New York, I was there. Ireland was reporting on several of those goals. But nobody knows at home that we're supposed to be complying with them, etc. It's a kind of strange lack of a proper attention. But the point I want to make is the negotiations and the conclusion of those 17 sustainable goals that said we will leave no one behind, we will prioritize the furthest behind first, and we will deal with all these issues and live sustainably. That was clearly voluntary. And then we came towards the Paris Climate Agreement, and I was even more focused on it. And we were told it was a treaty, but it became weaker and weaker, as you remember, John, as we negotiated. But the small island states and the least developed countries kept pleading. We must have 1.5 degrees, not going above 1.5 degrees in the text, because otherwise we will go under. And there was a mantra in the street in Paris, 1.5 to stay alive. And we did get that newly phrased goal, which was that we must stay well below 2 degrees Celsius of warming, above pre-industrial standards, the way John explained it. And we have to work at 1.5 degrees. And I thought, and I think most people thought at that stage, this is for the small island states. This is for the poorest countries, because they worked so hard to get that into the text. But the scientists had never studied this. And therefore, we had to ask, the Paris Climate Agreement asked the world's scientists, called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to explain, as John has explained, the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, and if we have to stay at 1.5 degrees, what do we have to do? And as John was explaining, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is very serious, because that's roughly where the coral reefs, as he said, disappear, where the Arctic ice may go, where the permafrost will melt and send up not just carbon, but methane, far more serious. And then the scientists say, this is loop back, and we're very worried. So we should stay, the whole world, scientists said, should stay at not more than 1.5 degrees. And they said it is doable if we have the political will. But what we have to do is, we have to reduce by 45% our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And as John was explaining, and I think your PowerPoint ran out or something, the emissions went up last year, and they're going up this year, global emissions. So we're not reducing by 45%. That's the bad news. The very good news is what you also said. We're becoming aware, and we're really now of the view. And a few days ago, I was in New York because governments were reporting about how they were doing under the 2030 agenda with its 17 sustainable development goals, including goal 13 on climate change. And I was also there for the launch of a declaration by women. We have decided, women leaders, that the time has come where women actually have to take over. And this declaration was about, and it speaks to my podcast. Again, do any of you know about my podcast, Mothers of Invention? Can I see a little? Yeah, good, I hear a little thing. The byline of Mothers of Invention is that climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. And I do it with Maeve Higgins, who's a comedian, and we have great fun together, but we're very serious as well. But we do both. And Maeve will never explain, but I actually explain, because men in particular need to hear this, that man-made is generic, so we're all responsible. And a feminist solution definitely includes men, and the more men, the better. We are seeing more men adopting. What is a feminist solution? It's a solution based on equality, based on fairness, based on recognizing that we have to change from business as usual to a transformational approach, or we won't get there. And I think women understand that. We particularly understand it because we're talking about our children and grandchildren.
I think it's very true that men can't multitask. And this is a problem which needs multitasking. Yep. And it's very true that women tend to be better multitaskers. I know I'm a useless multitasker, so I think some of what you say echoes with me in the sense that we need a multi-pronged attack on this complex problem. It's what's called a wicked problem by many people. So, somebody that can see the broader perspective and the angles of attack are crucial. Mary, you mentioned the Paris Agreement, and I was there for that euphoric event in 2015 where we thought things were really going to recover from the car crash that was Copenhagen. Could you tell us a little about what was going on there behind the scenes in terms of the obstructions that were being placed, in terms of what you wanted to get in that agreement as well?
Well, in a way, it was getting weaker in the negotiations, but China under President Xi and the United States under President Obama sort of backed each other and said, we will have an agreement. And then the most important thing in the agreement, as far as I'm concerned, was the goal of staying well below 2 degrees, working for 1.5, and getting that interpreted. And then, of course, we had a change in politics in the United States with the election of President Trump, who from the beginning said he was going to pull the United States out. And I actually begin this book with being in Marrakesh for the next conference after Paris, and everybody was so depressed because President Trump was pulling the United States out. In fact, he can't do that legally because it's a treaty until the 4th of November 2020. And do you know when the next presidential election is? The 3rd of November 2020. So we'll see. There are a lot of people now in the United States, and there's a big coalition called We Are Still In, of all kinds of people, including states, cities, business, civil society, women, children, you name it. And they're all keen to try and make sure that they keep faith with Paris as much as possible. But I actually have got to the stage where I have a message of 3 steps for any audience, any captive audience, and you're captive at the moment as far as I'm concerned. You can't get out until I tell you your message about 3 steps. And I do want you to take this very seriously. The first step is make climate change personal in your life, because it's so important. Now, how do you know you're making it personal? By the fact that when you go out the door, you're going to have made up your mind to do something you weren't doing when you came in this morning, meaning something that reduces your own footprint a bit. You may decide to recycle more carefully, be more, turning off more lights, using less water, etc., using less waste, getting rid of waste, using public transport. I use the bus all the time now, going in and out of my office in Dublin. I get the free pass, so no problem to me.
And we met on the bus.
Yes, we met on the bus. John and I met on the bus about a few weeks ago, and we talked about being here. That's quite right. And then I'm a pescatarian. I've given up meat. And that is also trying to signal that beef is very much part of an Irish problem, because we have a very big focus on beef and milk, and they are very bad on climate. And maybe you want to talk about that, John. It's a sensitive subject for me. So that's the first step. Do something that is your ownership of the climate issue, because you've got to take ownership of it. It's too important. And then get angry and get active. Get angry with those who have more responsibility and aren't doing enough. And that is governments at all levels and all over the world, but particularly governments of rich countries like Ireland. They've got to do more. Now we have the plan. That's good. Maybe bits of it aren't as good as you'd like, John, but anyway, at least to have a plan. But everything's going to mean, are we going to implement? And are we going to be more ambitious, which we have to be? And get active. Support with your voice, support with your vote, and also support those who are working hard, like the school children who are coming out, Fridays for Future, even Extinction Rebellion, because it's disruptive. We need to be disrupted, to be honest. We really do. A bit of disruption would be no harm. And the third step is the most important one of all, and that is that we have to imagine this world that we need to hurry towards. The scientists said last October we have 12 years. Actually, now it's 11 years and we're in July, and we're more than halfway through July. So what is this world? It's going to be a much healthier world, because we won't have the fumes of fossil fuel that choke up cities, kill people. We'll have to have a much more equal world, because the 2030 agenda said leave no one behind. That means we get to the 1 billion people, 1.2 billion. And Nick always wants me to tell about that in old money, as he calls it. 1,200 million people who never switch the switch for electricity. They still light their homes with kerosene and candles, and it's dangerous. Of our world of 7.7 billion or 7.8 billion, 2.3 billion still cook on dirty cooking, charcoal, wood, animal dung, peat. And they have the indoor fumes that kill a large number. These are our moonshots today. We were having a lot of, John F. Kennedy saying, we have to do the hard thing, put a man on the moon, and we must do it in 8 years, and they did. And they're very proud of it, and we're marking it now 50 years later. We need moonshots to get to those people with clean energy, because then they will take themselves out of the deepest poverty. Secondly, we know that we had a bad situation Is it in 1985 that we learned about the ozone layer? Isn't that right?
No, even before that. Yeah.
Even before that.
79 probably.
Yeah, but we took steps and we had the Montreal Protocol. And it became a binding treaty. And even when China was cheating a bit recently, they found that they were able to monitor and correct it. Now, climate change is much more complicated. It covers much more areas. That's why we need the Sustainable Development Goals. But if we are really serious, which we're beginning to be, we can do it. The scientists said it was doable. If we have the political will, we have to create the political will. And let me just tell you something about the world we need to see. I was lucky enough to see that world. Last November, I went with Nick to Venice because I was invited to the closing of the Architectural Biennale in Venice because it was curated by two Irish women architects, Grafton architects. They were friends of ours, and we were so proud of them, Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara. And what they did was they chose the earth as their client, and they invited architects from around the world respond. You know, what does this mean to you as architects? The earth is your client. And literally, we walked through this vast hall with Shelley and Yvonne, and they showed us, you know, the circular economy, not just individual electric cars, but mobile, you know, vehicles, buses, not looking like buses, but mobile electric vehicles, how we would live together in a different way. Even saris from Bangladesh that were discarded by poor women. There was good cloth in part of the sari, retrieved for high fashion. And acupuncture architecture by a Chinese architect, a wonderful woman, who worked in very rural China. And what she did was, she and her team would go into a village and listen to this poor village, what would make a difference. And I remember one story, there was a river going through the village and a broken bridge. Now, in a way, you know, architects can fix a bridge, but what they found when they listened was if in mending the bridge, there could be a covered part in the middle where both sides could meet, talk, exchange, gossip, trade even, that would make a huge difference. And that was the kind of acupuncture architecture. So we need to think and want that world, whereas a lot of people, you know, and the emphasis is on we have to give up things. We have to stop doing things. And it is true that we have to give up plastic, and I'm glad we don't have single plastic bottles, we have real bottles here in front of us. And we're learning now that plastic is really damaging in so many ways, that we use far too much of it. But we use far too much stuff anyway. And we're encouraged to buy stuff because that's driving the economy. We have to think about that, and we have to find a different way of developing relationships and using materials. There are people involved in slow fashion. There are people involved in slow food. And all of this is to kind of change our ways. And you know, when I was growing up, because I'm an elder now, we learned to sew, we learned to darn, we learned to put on buttons. My brothers had hand-me-down clothes. And it wasn't the throwaway society that we've become. We don't need that to have a good life and to have a happy life. If we can, you know, rethink. And that's why I think at all levels, if we want to change behavior, who changes behavior in the family? Come on. Women.
In getting to that future, it's not easy. The world, even since Paris, has changed so much.
Yeah.
We have the growth of populism. We have an expansion of neoliberalism, which kind of run counter to the ideals of multilateralism, which you have always espoused through your life. Can individuals make a difference? Can individuals acting coherently together as the young people are at the moment, as Extinction Rebellion, for example, is at the moment, can they change, can they be an equal force, if you like, to the very powerful vested interests that lie ahead?
Well, first of all, I do agree with you. This is a very bumpy time. Far too much populism, nativism, my country firstism, which is not good. I mean, the reason we got those two great frameworks in 2015 is because we had the diplomatic push for it. And we had a president in the United States and a president of China who came together and said, we need to have this agreement. And then everybody else was influenced, and we got that agreement. The point I'm really making about the voluntary nature of the 2015 agreement, the 2030 agenda, and the Paris Climate Agreement is that science has now made them no longer voluntary. it's science that's kicking in. And not just that report that I mentioned of last October, but look at the report in May about biodiversity, that 1 million species could become extinct. And already we're very worried about the extinction of species. And David Attenborough has been speaking about this, and now he's linking it with climate and is a powerful voice and a trusted voice in speaking about it. And that's really very important. Can the people, a population influence? I think yes, because I noticed when I was in Copenhagen and then successive climate conferences that the ministers who came from developed countries, including Ireland, came with no pressure from home because nobody knew they were there. Mm-hmm. Nobody even knew they were there or cared what they were doing. So they could, agree or not agree, whatever they wanted to. The only ones who cared were the presidents of small island states who were sweating to try and move the agenda along. The poorest African countries, indigenous communities, the indigenous platform, literally pressing, and they're still doing it at every COP. But if we can get a mobile population pressurizing more, so that politicians know this now is top of the agenda, and it has to be, it must be, and we must have more transformative change. Then I think that will make a difference. And the good thing is, I watched Greta Thunberg. I got a photo of her as a tiny 15-year-old outside her Swedish parliament with this handwritten sign. And I thought, oh my God, that's interesting. I had no idea that she'd become a kind of superstar. And the great thing about her, which I love, is that she has made it very positive that she has Asperger's. So she has done more for Asperger's and autism, as well as for awareness of climate change. And to be 16 years old and have achieved that is quite something. And it's great that children in Galway, children in Dublin, children all over Ireland are now deciding Fridays for Future. And I hope they're getting support from teachers because they're learning far more by being aware, because they're right. They are not protected. They're not guaranteed a safe future. I happen to have these 6 grandchildren. The eldest is 15, Rory, he's in the beginning of the book. And, those grandchildren will be in their 30s and 40s in 2050. So I think about it a lot. More than half their life to lead, hopefully, if they're lucky enough to be alive and in good health. And they will share the world with at least 9 billion. People think now 9.5 billion people. At the moment, we have 7.7 or 8 billion. It's a huge increase that's built in now. If we would do the right thing, we can reduce that curve in the future. All we have to do is educate girls and women and have health systems that work and provide the contraceptives to the 200 million women in the world who want family planning devices and are prevented by bad policies or poverty from getting them. So, we really have a situation where more and more of us don't talk about climate change now. We talk about climate crisis. And I always talk about climate justice. And I always talk about hope, because that is really important.
And I think children are the great white hope. Those of you who are parents will know the power of what we call pester power. When the Green Schools child comes home and tells you shouldn't be doing that or you should be doing it another way. And that is, I think, that they are the cavalry on the hill waiting to come and rescue us. And we have to foster them as much as we can. And I think what Mary's saying is very true, that we need leadership to push from above in the multinational and UN sectors, emphasizing the SDGs, but we also need people to push from below to sensitize our own decision makers. This is a priority for us, and we will not vote for you unless you prioritize it for us. So I think that's the squeeze that's so important. The last thing I wanted to ask you before I turn things loose to the audience is your new role now as chair of the elders. Congratulations on that. It's a great honor. And maybe you could tell us a little about those and where their influence is going to be felt in the next few years.
Well, first of all, very big shoes to fill. When we were formed in 2007, when Nelson Mandela brought us together, actually yesterday, 2007, and now we're 2019, so 12 years ago. Because yesterday was, the day before yesterday, was Mandela's day now, but it was his birthday. And it was on his 89th birthday that he formed the elders. We'd had a planning meeting with him before that in May of 2007. And Archbishop Tutu was our first chair, and then Kofi Annan took over the chair when Arch, as we were always encouraged to call him, he had a T-shirt which was "Call Me Arch," you know, and Kofi Annan succeeded him, and then I was with Kofi Annan for his last mission in Zimbabwe. This time last year we were there, and he was pushing himself. He wasn't feeling well, and he got pneumonia on the flight back to Geneva, and he never recovered. You know, he died shortly after that. The elders have, I suppose, three overarching priorities, and the first is the one that you mentioned: multilateralism. You know, the importance of a world that can speak together and solve problems together, because the problems are problems we cannot solve as individual countries, and they are the problems. The next things are the two existential threats that we worry about: nuclear disarmament, nuclear non-proliferation. It's going the wrong way. We're seeing the unraveling of existing nuclear treaties. We're seeing rearming of nuclear missiles. It is very, very worrying. And this doomsday clock is nearer to doomsday than it's ever been. So, you know, that's frightening. And secondly, climate change. Climate change is an existential threat, because you saw what John was showing. We're in danger of making ourselves extinct, making other species extinct. We're on the road to it unless we change, and we're on the road to making life very difficult to live for those born today and their children and grandchildren. So, you know, I think that's why the elders are very active at the moment. We had a discussion in the Security Council. I was addressing the Security Council with Ban Ki-moon. Ban Ki-moon, who gave me 3 mandates in his day and was my boss, is now I'm his boss, because he's my deputy. Ban Ki-moon and Graça Machel are 2 deputy chairs, and we have now 11 elders. 12 is probably the maximum number. We're looking for a replacement for Jimmy Carter, wonderful, wonderful former president, former president, Nobel Prize winner, etc. And we'd like an American, but we're kind of scratching around at the moment. Hope we'll find one. And we do try to keep a gender balance also in the elders. We were in China not very long ago and had a meeting with President Xi and his team across a table, I'm glad to say, because there were 5 of us as elders and President Xi and his top brass in China for more than an hour and a quarter. And talking very much about both nuclear issue and trying to get China to be more involved in the fact that Russia and the United States aren't talking and are more and more moving away from even the agreements they have, and the START treaty that's coming up and the nuclear non-proliferation treaty that will be discussed again. You know, it's very worrying. They weren't willing to engage there. They said, we will respond accordingly, meaning we'll build more missiles probably. But on climate, they were actually, I mean, what we were saying was, would China do a bit more? Because China has, it has kind of met its commitments. I mean, you know this better than I do, John, but more or less met its commitments under the Paris Agreement because it didn't overcommit. And my impression of China is it commits and implements, but it doesn't commit enough. It could commit more. Yeah, and that's what we were trying to persuade it.
Great. Well, you've regaled us with your breadth of international affairs here, ranging so widely from nuclear disarmament to climate. But I think it's an opportunity now for you, the audience, to maybe pick up on maybe things that we've missed here and have the opportunity to ask Mary questions. So I'm going to go over here and try and see if I can see in the dark anybody who'd like to start the ball rolling. So, one in the front row. I think we'll take 3 at a time so that we don't take too long. So we'll start here, and then the lady in black up there, and then maybe somebody over here, the lady in orange over here. It helps if you wear brightly colored clothes at these events, you know. Okay, let's start here.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for today. My question was about reaching people and the message that you're reaching out to people. And in talks like this, you're very often talking to people who are already on the same page as you. But the populist politicians, the nationalist message, they've been elected by huge groups of people who support those people that they have elected. So how do we reach the people those large swathes of people who are not in this room, who are not on the same page as us, who do not agree with what we say, and not to criticize them and not to blame them, but to reach out to them and say, okay, what is your view and how can we bring you to our side, rather than saying, you're the problem, you're not the solution, we're all going to stay on this side. How do we reach those people that need to be reached?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And there was one lady in black up here, then second.
Good morning, thank you. The person who's been competing for your attention is this very, very beautiful baby down here on my left, possibly the youngest member of the audience. And I'm conscious of how many of us are trying to stop doing bad things that we've started. And I'm just wondering, what are the things that we can not allow the youngest, ever start that would help improve the situation?
Okay,
Wow.
thanks. And the third one was the lady in orange over here.
I like to refer to Mary's third step, which is to show the future. And I think that's really important, and to show what the world can look like instead of always being a negative message. And I'd like to refer to an event in Castlebar in the Museum of Country Living, where they showed rural electrification was driven by women being shown what electricity could bring to their lives. So if we show the positive world that we can achieve, I think that could be very useful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Three very good points and questions, and I'm looking forward to more. And first of all, on the need to reach those who need to be reached, as you put it. I had a very interesting experience of that recently, believe it or not. I was in the Vatican for the second convening of the heads of oil and gas companies and the heads of financial institutions that fund oil and gas, convened by Cardinal Turkson, a Ghanaian, a good friend, because he went, you know him, yeah.
He was involved in the Laudato Si publication.
That's right. We were together for that, yeah.
Yes.
And Cardinal Turkson was convening them, and then Pope Francis had come along last year, and he came along again this year at the end. But last year it wasn't very successful. But this year they had prepared 2 draft potential statements. One of them was on carbon pricing, and the other was on carbon risk disclosure. And before we got on to discussing those 2 statements, we discussed just transition. And just transition is, we have to move out of fossil fuel, we have to do it quickly, we have to move out of peat in Ireland, Bord na Móna and all of that. We have to have just transition, meaning that the workers don't bear the brunt of it, and their families and their communities. That we actually take a whole lot of steps, reskilling those who can learn new skills, putting industry into those areas, pensioning off those who worked for a long number of years and deserve to be pensioned off, etc. All of these is part of the just transition. Interestingly, this group couldn't agree a statement on just transition. We had a discussion that went all over the place, but at least we discussed. But they actually signed up to carbon pricing. It was a weak statement, but the point was the signatures. The head of ExxonMobil, the head of Total, the head of BP, the head of Shell, they were all there, and the finance people. And they also signed up to climate risk disclosure. Now, then the Pope came along, and we had a group photograph, and he shook hands with everyone because he was quite pleased with that program. He's trying to do exactly what you said, and we all need to try. And we need to try to convey in those states in the United States that voted so heavily for President Trump that they are not baddies, that they have contributed to the economy of the United States, that we need a just transition, and we need money for that just transition up front. And until we can move that thing, I don't think we'll really succeed in talking about that.
Just an addendum to that little story about Big Oil going to meet Pope Francis. What Big Oil wanted from that first meeting was really a photograph of them with Pope Francis.
And they didn't get it.
And they didn't get it.
Yeah.
They got it the second meeting after they had come back with more progressive ideas.
That's quite right.
So it shows you the power. And indeed, faith communities are very effective at the moment. They are one of the people who are making a lot of the running in this area. And the Laudato Si has been a very influential document in this area. So what Mary is saying is that a lot of different strands of the community are working on this topic now, and your help is obviously needed.
And the second question, I've never been asked before, it's an intriguing question. Let me just try this one thing. May she never touch plastic. That might help, That's a challenge to you. And the Showing the Future, yes, that was a wonderful museum exhibition yesterday in Castlebar. I've just come from there. I had the honor of formally opening it. And I wanted to do it in particular because I remembered vividly my father, a medical doctor for about 55 years or 60 years in Ballina, working in a whole countryside because there weren't very many doctors, especially at the beginning. And the difference it made to births in the home, and a lot of births were in the home, to have rural electrification. The difference it made to women's mental health because of getting away from the drudgery of things that could be done by machines. And it's a really good exhibition, and I was delighted to be involved in it. And we did talk about exactly this world that we need to move to.
Okay, 3 more. I'll start on this side. I think there's a young person with blue there with his hand up. Let's go there first. No.
I was just wondering what children could do directly to help climate change.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, and there's a lady standing up with a spotted dress there, very prominent. I'll come to you then.
Hi, I'm so delighted to be here. I live in a really conscious community in West Cork, but I'm really astounded by the amount of friends who are really protesting against smart meters and wind farms.
Yeah.
So any advice or where to direct them would be hugely appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah.
And lastly, person in blue here. Sorry, in black. Yeah.
At present, there are 200,000
Let's wait for a mic.
Currently, there are 200,000 transatlantic passenger jet journeys, spewing vast amounts of water vapor into the stratosphere. That's never mentioned. By 2030, there will be 800,000 such transatlantic journeys. What do we do?
Okay. Again, 3 very good points and questions. The first one, I think, is an important one about children. What can children do directly? Because it's clear that when children start to do things, it matters. And we've seen this, with the Fridays for Future, just protesting and coming out of school to protest. Nobody wants children to be out of school, who should be in school. But actually, it's more educational sometimes to realize that there's no point in being in school if your future is not going to be protected. So I think children can educate their parents and their grandparents, by simply asking questions, making points. I think teachers are more aware now and are probably teaching, and there are green schools that are great, as you said, John. And so I think children can play a significant role now, and we need it. And I'm very, very supportive of the Fridays for Future, a movement of children and young people. I liked that question from West Cork because you're right that we have to get people to understand the importance of wind farms, the importance of smart meters, the importance of the steps we're going to take. Mistakes have been made in sometimes planning too big a project in the wrong place. I'm fully agreeing with that. We're talking about forestry, and there's a lot of controversy about it. But let's get our heads around. We need to be on the right side of this, and we need to welcome the steps that will give us the clean energy, that will give us, and I talked recently to the guy who's involved at the center of the wind farm from an NGO point of view, and not from a business point of view. And he says there is great potential in wind for Ireland, including both onshore and offshore. And we have to go that way, and we must do it as quickly as possible. Similarly with smart meters, I can't understand why people would object to them, because they'll help your budget. If you have a smart meter, you'll know what you're using, and you can. And also, we need to get to the stage where people are encouraged to do retrofitting, because they will get tax relief or some benefits. The sooner we can do that, the better, because the more people can be encouraged to do the right thing, the better. You mentioned the transatlantic jets. Flying generally, I am very aware that because I want to message, I fly quite a lot. I offset the flights that I make, the elders offset as a policy, and if I'm not going as an elder, I will ask, are you offsetting this flight? And offset means money goes to those who are bringing clean energy, doing afforestation, whatever, doing the right thing. But I now try as much as possible to send my voice. I do quite a lot of videos, and they're more or less the messaging that I'm doing to you, but it's shorter. If you're sending it's maximum 10 minutes, because nobody can endure watching a video of one person speaking for longer than that, I think, or shouldn't have to endure. So, and we all have to be accountable. And I'm glad that France has decided to put a further tax, basically, on people flying, and more on business flying and so on. I think we'll all have to do this. We've got to get real about these things. People have to think about their holidays. And, Greta Thunberg has given a great example in not flying at all, and yet being able to be a big messenger about climate.
It's one of the difficulties in getting Greta to Ireland. She won't fly. Yep. But we're working on it. Yes, you're very right. And perhaps the day will come when your frequent flyer card will go the opposite way. Instead of getting benefits, you'll get costs for your frequent flyer card. Who knows? Okay, we have time for 3 more. And I know everybody now is going to wave at me. Let's take the gentleman in grey there first. And then for gender balance, well, no, we wouldn't go for gender balance. We'll go for this gentleman in red here. And then we'll go over here to a lady. Who can I? No, I need a lady. Yes, I see a lady with a lovely scarf there. Okay, yeah.
Hi, I'm from New Zealand, so excuse the accent, but very good to be here. I've been looking at protesting, letter writing, all these sorts of things happening for years. They're not working. In 2019, governments are still woefully inadequate on their planning. I'd like to hear your views on civil disobedience and the role of things like Extinction Rebellion in actually moving us much faster towards where we need to be.
Okay. And this gentleman in red?
Given the lack of politics on the required climate actions, do you think that the current parliamentary democracy models are suitable for that, or should we find some way to speed up the necessary changes to transition?
And the lady in the scarf up here.
Gave me the mic, did they? Hi, I'm sorry if I skipped someone. They meant that. I was wondering, so Galway City Council have their draft climate adaptation strategy out for public review at the moment. And I was wondering what advice you'd give to everybody in this room about engaging with things like that, and what, like, how we can make the most of opportunities to maybe change the direction or contribute to those kind of strategies, but also what advice you'd give to local authorities in Ireland on how to adapt to the climate emergency.
Again, really good points. The voice from New Zealand. New Zealand actually is doing a lot, and I think Jacinda Ardern is a wonderful leader, but that's just beside the point. I've had the privilege of meeting her. I have a lot of time for those who are feeling it's time now for peaceful protest, like Extinction Rebellion, because they've thought through, exactly as you said, for all the growing awareness, and I'm glad there is much more awareness, until we see that curve bending, we cannot say that we're anyway on course for a safe world for our children and grandchildren. It's as mad as that. So we have to disrupt the business as usual. We have to use all ways of doing it. In many ways, I was on a panel in London not so long ago. I actually want to talk about this for a second, so you give me a chance to do it. I was at the retrospective exhibition of an artist friend of mine, and you'll know who I'm talking about, Oliver Eliason. Oliver had the ice belts at Paris. You see, he's shaking his head, nodding his head. And he also had these little suns. Look at that. Little sun. He has a foundation. He's an artist. He has a foundation, and he's got 1 million of these little suns to parts of the developing world that don't have light. For children even for home, and they're quite strong. And they, they're you just put them out into the sun, and they recharge. So where did I get now? Why was I saying that? Yeah, Extinction Rebellion. What I was saying was we need to use everything, all the means that are, and I think peaceful protest is now warranted for those who feel they can engage in it, but we also have to have hope. And sometimes Extinction Rebellion, message in a way that's almost hopeless.
It is, and it doesn't come natural to, if you like, people of my generation, of Mary's generation, to get involved in that kind of disruption activities. But I think it's a measure of the seriousness of the problem that we face, that we do have to think the unthinkable in many respects in this area. So what Mary is saying, I think, is something that is increasingly shared by the bulk of society and not simply the fringes of society.
Yeah.
And that's when that happens and when that's accepted, then change will come even quicker.
Yeah. And on the parliamentary models question, I know there are people who feel, it's all very well for China. The president of China says we'll do this and they do it, etc. It's easier. Actually, I don't think it is necessarily. But parliamentary democracies came together in 2015. 193 countries, and most of them were democracies or called themselves democracies, to agree the 2030 agenda. And 195 countries came together for the Paris Climate Agreement. So it is possible. And then it's all now about their nationally determined contributions. That's what we're watching. The Irish national determined contributions and the other thing, and they must become more ambitious. So it's down now to country level. So it's all about putting pressure, and I think a democracy is as good at putting pressure on a government as anyone else, if people wake up and use that pressure. And that gets me to the Galway City Council. I think that's extraordinarily important. I'm not in a position to kind of give very wise advice, but one thing that I think all city councils and all governments have to do is get to 2050 mentally and work backwards. Okay, we've got to be zero carbon by 2050. We've got to be much reduced by 2030. We're now in halfway through 2019. What do we do? And that's the transformative approach. When you put the stake in the ground and work backwards, you get there. And we're beginning to see that. I'm an honorary businesswoman in the sense I'm an honorary member of the B team of business leaders. And the B team in January 2015, so before Paris, in Davos, of course, I was in Davos with them, said that they would be net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and do it the climate justice way, with just transition, because they knew that they would have to talk, how to deal with those who work in fossil fuel industry. And they have now decided to up their ambition. They've got the whole of We Mean Business to more or less commit. That's a business group that comes, about 400 businesses, that follow the climate world very closely. There's a self-interest. They know that it won't help business if the world becomes more unlivable. There's no business case for not having a future. And as my friend Sharon Burrow often says, there are no jobs on a dead planet. Actually, the planet won't die. We'll become extinct and the planet will recover. But that's the negative scenario. So it's all about committing to where you want to be. For institutions in 2050, 2030, and then back to 2019 and work it out.
Okay. One last quick round, and I shortchanged a lady up here with a nice scarf because somebody had a nicer scarf. So I'll go with this lady with the green scarf now.
There were hands at the back that were waving furiously. Are there hands at the back that were waving, or have they just gone? They may have gone.
Way in the back row.
No, I think they've
young boy with black. He's been waiting patiently for a long time as a second one, and then we'll give the lady. We'll give the ladies the last word here. I think it's appropriate. Okay. Lady in the greenish, dark green dress. Yeah. Okay, let's start over here.
Hello, thank you very much. I am actually a city councillor, so on the last question I would, and for the Green Party, so I would encourage people to put in their submissions on the adaptation plan and to ask for it to be much more radical and far-sighted. I just want to say to ask really, I suppose this, I've seen the presentation from yourself, Professor, several times, and this seems the most hopeful, dare I say it, and I'm just wondering if that is how yourself and Mary would see it, that there have been actual steps made beyond, I suppose, Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, that we've seen something concrete in other jurisdictions that would lead us to be more hopeful. Thank you.
Okay. Young man up here almost in the back row.
Okay. Global warming is a bad thing on the planet. And the idea of solar panels are sometimes a little bad.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we put it in space? Because, say, the moon or Mercury have no atmosphere or clouds to block the sunlight. So you use the solar panel. You put solar panels all over the dead worlds. So with all the solar panels, you could basically power Earth. There's also the Dyson's swarm, which is basically an entire group of solar panel satellites in orbit. That's the question.
Okay.
Would that be good for us?
Okay. Okay. And that is technological optimism at its best. And the lady here with the last word.
You both touched on agriculture through the impacts our beef exports are having and diet in particular. And I wondered if you'd just comment on that in a little more detail. You mentioned that you're a pescatarian, Mary, but I think buying local is something that should be emphasised a lot more. We have a really excellent resource in local beef here, and the impact of buying that local beef is much more beneficial than buying vegetables, for example, from South America. And I wonder if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, actually three very good points again, and I think I'm going to end with the member for the Green Party, because that's the end. I want to end on a hopeful note, so I'll come back to it. But a very intriguing young voice wanting to look at ideas of satellites in orbit, and there is actually a lot of discussion at the moment, what we call geoengineering ideas that can help us. The elders actually are going to look at governance of geoengineering as one of the ways in which we will look at climate change, because we believe that we need good ideas, we need innovation, but we need to make sure that it's good for everyone and that it doesn't have bad effects, particularly in poorer parts of the world, that could be abused by this geoengineering for the rich world. But I like the idea that a young voice is thinking about innovative ideas, because the scientists have told us we still need innovation. We need carbon capture. We need to think about even more battery reduction, the battery size reduction, so that batteries can last longer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very good question. On the agriculture, I am a very strong believer in the buying local. I have listened to a wonderful former elder now. She's an elder emerita, meaning that she's retired from the elders. A wonderful voice. I aspire at some stage to become an elder emerita, but I actually feel I probably have the time that the scientists have given us. If I'm healthy, that's the time I'll have. It isn't 12 years, it's now 11 and a half years. And if my health is good, I'm going to be on the case for the next 11 and a half years. But the point I wanted to make is that Ela Bhatt, a wonderful woman from India that some of you may know about, she formed the Self-Employed Women's Association of very poor Indian women in the informal sector. And when I asked her how many members, about 1.5 million, in Ahmedabad in particular. I visited her when I was President of Ireland. We've been friends since then, or even before that. And she believes that it would be very intelligent if we had a world where everybody bought within a 100-mile radius, whatever they wanted. It's a very interesting idea. A very interesting idea. Instead of You know, I think it's really worth thinking about. So, you know, that it would all be within 100 miles. She used old-fashioned, not kilometers, but miles. and she's spoken about this and she's written about it. And I think there's a lot to think about there. I wanted to, as I say, come back to the idea that John sounded a wee bit more hopeful, and I hope I sounded hopeful because I am. The scientists have made it clear this is doable if we have the political will. That's what they said. This is doable if we have the political will. And as John said, we need the political will, the international being more inspiring, and it's not at the moment. It's not a good time. The national is where it has to happen with plans. We have the Irish government plan. We need to see how it's going to be implemented, how it's going to be improved, how it's going to be whatever. And then the local, the Galway City Council has its role to play, and all of the others. And I want to tell a story that I enjoyed very much at the time and have thought about a great deal since then, of the first chair of the elders, Archbishop Tutu, my beloved Archbishop Tutu, but I'll call him Arch because that's what he asked us to call him. And Arch and I were in New York about 8 or 9 years ago, I think it is now. We were on a panel for a social good conference organized by the UN Foundation. And the social good conferences are for young people who are supposed to be on their iPhones and their iPads, etc., and create a big buzz of social media so that, if possible, one would trend, the trending and all that. And when Archbishop Tutu gets in front of young people, of course, he expresses his love, his belief in them. You know, you're good, you're great, God loves you, you know, and all this sort of thing. And his arms were waving. And we were being moderated by a CNN journalist. And she said to Archbishop Tutu very sharply, "Archbishop Tutu, why are you such an optimist?" And he looked at her, and he shook his head, and he said, "Oh no, dearie," called her dearie. "Oh no, dearie," he said, "I'm not an optimist, I'm a prisoner of hope." And I remember at the time thinking, this man, you know, the fight he had against apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that he presided over. I watched him cry on television. I was in South Africa for some of the hearings, and it was so painful. He was crying, and I've seen the effect, it's had an effect on him, and I've seen it up close since we became elders together. The reason to be a prisoner of hope is the glass may not be half full. If you can see it, because I've been drinking, it's about less than a third full. But the point is, you work with what's in the glass, and you become more resilient. You do what is necessary. And that's what this book on climate justice is all about. It's stories of people who were affected terribly in their food security, in their livelihoods, in their health, and everything by a problem they didn't cause: climate change, emissions. They don't drive cars, they don't have big manufacturing, and they're buffeted and battered, and they fought back very, very courageously because they have hope, because they know that that's what makes a difference. Whereas if you talk about climate, and I don't think any of us should talk about climate, in a way that's so stark and negative, all the energy goes out of the room. And actually what happens is people say, yeah, well, that's not my problem. I'll just get on with my life. There's nothing I can do. Whereas it's the opposite. It's the 3 steps. It's making it personal, it's getting angry and getting active, and it's imagining this world we need to be moving towards as rapidly as possible, like they did in Castlebar with that wonderful exhibition on rural electrification that made such a difference. So I've become a prisoner of hope. I think we all have to become prisoners of hope, and there is much to work for by becoming prisoners of hope. So let's work away together.
Well, Mary, although you are a prisoner of hope, we hope you don't get remission for good behaviour, because we need you to be around a lot longer than the 11 and a half years ahead of us today. We've been privileged to listen to, I think, an exceptional individual, somebody who has epitomised Ireland abroad, but somebody who has now, if you like, found a new lease of life. And Mary tells me, far from slowing down, she's now accelerating again. And I'm delighted that we have on our side for this all-important struggle of the 21st century. Somebody of the caliber, somebody of the reputation, somebody who has the insight and the influence of Mary Robinson. And we've been privileged to listen to her this morning. So on your behalf, I'd like to thank her for what has been an inspirational hour and a half together. Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Thank you.